Morphology of Middle High German. In today's lecture on morphology, we will move away from discrete linguistic signs like graphemes and phonemes and focus our attention on the smallest meaningful linguistic units, morphemes. Morphology is commonly divided into two areas. The first concerns the arrangement of morphemes within the same lexeme, which is inflectional morphology. The second is the arrangement of morphemes to create new lexemes, which is word formation. We will deal with Middle High German word formation in detail in the next lecture, while today will be about the rules for the inflection of Middle High German morphemes. It is by no means trivial to point out that not all Middle High German words have different word forms.
Ich sag, des sicherlichen war, eins geboren Sohn, der trug ein Haar, das was rede und de Fall. Ab der Achsel hin Zetall mit Länge es volle Gliechen gierk. In eine Huben es fierk, du was von wilden Wähe. Ich wähn niemand, gesähe so mannigen Vogel uf Huben. Sittiche und de Tuben, die waren all dar uf genaht. Wollt ihr nur hören, was das dat?
When it comes to prepositions like ob, mit, in, von, or üf, adverbs like so, nu, or da, as well as coordinating conjunctions like unde, there is no need to look them up in a dictionary. If you did decide to do so, you might find that they are listed there exactly as they appear in the text. The distinction between words and word forms makes no sense for terms like these, since they are all either non-inflecting words or represent non-inflecting parts of speech. For the historical linguist, however, it is noteworthy that words or entire parts of speech can change their inflectional status over the course of a language's history. In the history of German, this primarily concerns adverbs. In Middle High German, adverbs can be derived from adjectives using the suffixes
liche or liechen.
This option is lost by New High German. Adjectival adverbs lose their inflectional ending and appear in the zero form of their adjective base. An account of the inflectional morphology of Middle High German would have to deal with adverbs, while adverbs in New High German have become morphologically uninteresting, as they no longer inflect. How can we determine the basic units of inflectional morphology more precisely? We have already established that morphemes are the smallest and meaningful units in a language. Their meaning can be either lexical or grammatical. As such, a distinction is made between lexical and grammatical morphemes, with lexical morphemes often being referred to as base morphemes. Secondly, morphemes can be distinguished based on their distribution, specifically according to whether they can occur freely or are bound to certain companions in their realization. Base morphemes and grammatical morphemes can occur both free and bound. Middle High German lang can only occur alone, and is classified as a free base morpheme, while Middle High German Salb can only be realized in conjunction with an inflectional ending, and must therefore be understood as a bound base morpheme, which occurs, for example, in the imperative form Salbe. Middle High German ich carries exclusively grammatical information. The pronoun realizes the first person singular, but it can also occur alone, while derivational morphemes such as era in dichtere, meaning author, and inflectional morphemes such as the genitive singular ending s are always realized in a bound form. If we try to summarize this overview, we can say that today's focus is on a class of bound grammatical morphemes of Middle High German, namely its inventory of inflectional morphemes. Particular interest should be given less to an exhaustive description of the inventory than to cases that show significant changes for the Middle High German inflectional system, compared to its Old High German predecessor. To do this, we must first provide a brief description of the Old High German inflectional system, without which we cannot appropriately assess the innovations which took place in Middle High German. Furthermore, Middle High German inflectional morphology offers rich material for observing the interplay of phonological and morphological change. At the beginning of the Middle High German period, the weakening of unstressed syllables, which we discussed last week, would have almost led to the collapse of central areas of inflection, had it not been for the morphological functionalization of a further phonetic development, namely palatal or secondary umlaut. Because the consequences of the weakening of unstressed syllables in this area are particularly obvious, we will begin our overview with noun inflection, before turning to Middle High German innovations in the area of verbal inflection. So first, nominal inflection in Middle High German. In German, nouns realise the categories of case and number, and indeed have done so throughout all its historical periods. From the very beginning, and despite all prophecies of doom, the four cases of nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative, and the two numbers singular and plural, have existed in German to this very day. Grammatical gender is usually mentioned as a further relevant nominal category in German, but it is a lexical grammatical category rather than a classic nominal category. Whether a noun is masculine, feminine, or neuter does not depend on its syntactic or morphological function, but is defined for each lexical entry and is therefore an inherent feature. Of course, this does not mean that there are no cases of multiple gender, as one can easily imagine given how spatially differentiated Middle High German is. This mostly affects basic vocabulary items. For New High German Die Schlange, the recently published Morphology volume of the New Middle High German Grammar lists only 2 feminine tokens, compared to 19 masculine tokens.
So der Hirz den Slangen siehet, in dem Loche da lieget, so blaset in das Loch und triebet den Slangen us. And then, und dir große Slange sterbite.
For New High German Die Sonne, the grammar lists over 200 feminine examples, but also 26 masculine tokens, which disappear, however, during the 13th century. The following evidence from the Weltchronik of Rudolf von Ems indicates that gender variations can also occur within the same source.
Da der Sonne aufgart, ihr Landmarke Zilgestat. Und da kommt weder Schnee noch Regen noch Schatte vor der Sonnenschein.
To be able to better assess the scope of the restructuring of noun inflection in Middle High German, let us first briefly review some prehistory. In Gothic, an East Germanic language primarily attested in the 4th and 5th centuries, noun inflection follows a pattern of which there are hardly any traces left in Middle High German. For illustration, let us consider the dative plural, Gothic dagam. In Gothic, each inflected form of a noun consisted of 3 segments. First is the root, the base morpheme carrying the lexical meaning, in this case dag, meaning day. The same root dag can occur in different words. In Old High German, for example, alongside the noun tag is the weak verb tagin, to become day. The inflectional ending comes at the end, m for the dative plural. Between the root and the inflectional ending, there is the word-forming element that occurs in numerous other words, and thus has a class-forming effect. Alongside Gothic dagam, we also have examples like Gothic steinam or wolfam. The element adjoined to the root is called the stem suffix. The combination of root and stem suffix is called the stem. The Germanic stem suffix a forms masculine and neuter gender nouns called a-stems. So starting from the situation we see in Gothic, the further history of noun inflection after the emergence of German presents itself as a steady reduction of inflectional morphemes. The 6-case system of the Germanic singular is reduced to a 2-case system in New High German. As we saw last week in connection with the Middle High German weakening of secondary syllables, the reason for this lies in the Germanic accent being fixed on the root syllable. Now let's look at this development in detail. In Old High German, the Germanic system of stem classes appears to have largely broken down. With the exception of the I stems, the naming of the inflection classes after the Old Germanic stem suffixes is barely comprehensible. However, a change had also taken place in this class insofar as the I is no longer a root suffix, but has been converted into an inflectional morpheme. There is certainly no lack of such inflectional morphemes in Old High German. Even if we restrict ourselves to the 4 core classes, we count 17 different inflectional endings that realise the nominal categories of case and number. The quantitative contrast to the Middle High German inventory could not be clearer. Middle High German was severely affected by the weakening of unstressed syllables, and only has 6 different inflectional endings. The long-term development that can be observed in the A stems, looking at Gothic dagans, right the way through to New High German tag, can also be confirmed and chronologically specified by comparing Old and Middle High German noun inflection. German comes to have fewer and fewer means of expressing the grammatical category of case. The decisive trigger for this Kasusnivellierung, so case levelling, is the weakening of unstressed syllables in Middle High German. In the long run, case levelling is not its only consequence. Of comparable importance from a systematic point of view is the complete collapse of the Germanic system of stem classes, which comes to be replaced by a new system structured according to synchronic morphological criteria. The changes in the class names from Old to Middle High German are not merely cosmetic. In the area of weak noun inflection, the Old High German N stems correspond to the first Middle High German inflection class. In the area of strong noun inflection, the O stems correspond to the second class, but the development of the A and I stems to the third and fourth Middle High German class is not so linear. We therefore should examine this restructuring process a little more closely, focusing on the development of the Old High German A and I stems. A major difference between the Old High German A and I stems was their plural inflection, which goes back to the Germanic stem suffix. The nominative plural of Old High German Tag, an A stem, was Tage. The nominative plural of Old High German Gast, an I stem, was Gesti. Accordingly, the nominative plural of Old High German Skilt, an I stem, was Skilti. In Old High German, the masculine nouns Gast and Skilt belong to the same inflection class, because they both have endings containing I. These endings, which are decisive for denoting class membership, fall victim to the weakening of unstressed syllables in the transition to Middle High German. What are we to make of this? First of all, it is striking that little has changed in the relationship between the Middle High German Tag and Gast in terms of their classification criteria. As before, Tag and Gast show differences in plural formation. It is just that the signifier that is changed compared to the Old High German predecessors. The plural ending is no longer distinctive. Old High German I and A have collapsed to Middle High German Rather, the presence or absence of the umlaut is the differentiator. The assumption that the presence of umlaut as a plural marker became the central criterion for the restructuring of the Old High German A and I stems, if not of the entire system, and it can now be substantiated by a series of further observations. Old High German I stems such as skilt, skilti, the root vowel of which cannot be subject to umlaut, no longer behave in Middle High German like their former Old High German classmates, but instead follow the pattern of the Old High German A stems. As such, they have no other choice, as the only signifier they shared with the I stems that were subject to umlaut, such as Gast, Gesti, were level to schwa in the suffix weakening. They share the same fate as all the other Old High German I stems that cannot be umlauted. Even more interesting is the development of the Old High German feminine I stems. On the one hand, it resembles what we have just observed in the masculine. The Old High German I stems, whose class criterion was the presence of I endings, so Kraft, Kräfti, and Zit, Ziti, are divided into two classes after the latter have been weakened. Firstly, old I stems with a root vowel subject to umlaut, so the new feminine nouns of the fourth class, like Kraft and Kräfte, and secondly, old I stems without an umlautable root vowel, the feminine third class nouns that had no equivalent in Old High German, like Zit, Zita. There is also a second tendency that begins to emerge in Middle High German. The fact that umlaut has replaced the I ending as an inflectional class feature is one thing, but the question of the morphological functionalization of the new criterion remains. In the area of fourth class masculine nouns, this is already transparent in Middle High German. In the singular, as a further development of the Old High German inflectional paradigm, there are only forms without umlaut. In the plural, there are only forms with umlaut. It is therefore obvious to interpret the umlaut as a new plural marker. Such an unambiguous interpretation of the fourth class feminine nouns too is prevented by the fact that umlauted forms not only occur in the entire plural, but can also occur in the genitive and dative singular as variants of non-umlauted forms. In Werner's Helmrecht, the noun Stadt in the dative singular occurs in both variants. If the rhyming word is Täter, the variant with umlaut is selected.
Svir viel ich fahr en Waddele, so bin ich an de Heiner Stätte, da man mir tue, als Mann im Tette. If, on the other hand, the rhyming word is Trat, the variant without umlaut appears. Ross, Ochsen und de Mannig Kur, ungezahlt du sind belibben, du us Hofe hat getrieben, dass ihr das Schloss von siner Stadt schoß, Svenne dazu trat.
As undecidedly as the fourth class feminine seem to behave regarding the functionalization of umlaut, double forms are illuminating for our understanding of longitudinal linguistic developments in Middle High German. In comparison with Old High German on the one hand and New High German on the other, they represent a transitional stage. The traditional umlauted forms in the genitive and dative singular indicate a phonological interpretation of umlaut. However, the simultaneous occurrence of non-umlauted forms in the singular is an indication of a morphological reinterpretation of umlaut, and is in fact a much clearer indication than in the case of the fourth-class masculines. Here, in principle, a morphological reinterpretation of Old High German phonology was sufficient. In the case of the feminine nouns, this reinterpretation led to the appearance of new, non-umlauted singular forms that have no equivalent in Old High German. This tendency is then unified on the path to New High German. The double forms disappear. With this, a development in the context of German noun inflection has come to a temporary end, which can be understood as a complementary process to the Kasusnivellierung, so case levelling, explained earlier. This process is called Numerusprofilierung, an increase in the tendency for the morphological marking of number. In a nutshell, the interaction of these two processes can be described as follows. In the course of German's development, inflective forms of nouns realise case less and less, and mark number more and more. Without context, New High German Stadt does not indicate whether it is nominative, genitive, dative, or accusative, but the classification as singular is clear. Finally, the fact that umlaut has become an essential means of expression for the realisation of the category number, which becomes increasingly prominent in New High German, can be shown by the third and fourth class neuters of Middle High German. These derive from a very small subclass of the Old High German A-stems, the so-called Eher-neuters, which often denoted domestic animals, like Lamm, Rind, and Kalb, and therefore have been informally known as the Hühnerhof-Deklination, or the chicken run declension. In connection with the realization of Numerusprofilierung, the Hühnerhof-Deklination is of interest because the class constitutive stem suffix ir causes an umlaut at the preceding root vowel. As we have just seen, the morphologically reinterpreted umlaut has been a privileged means of realizing the number category since Middle High German. A particularly strong indication of this would be if the same means were also used to form the plural of words that were anything but predestined to do so based on their structural history. And this is exactly what happens to the former neuters of the Old High German A-stems and their Middle High German successor, the third class. Their representatives were poorly prepared for the spread of Numerusprofilierung, as there were no inflectional endings in their nominative and accusative plural. However, the fact that plural is expressed by a zero morpheme contradicts the idea of morphological iconism, a fundamental principle of natural morphology, which, in a nutshell, states that more meaning should correspond to more expression. The neuters of the Middle High German third class solve this dilemma by often adopting the number marking procedure of the Hühnerhof-Deklination, as in the case of Middle High German Buch, which, since early New High German, has inflected according to the pattern
Blatt, Blätter.
Therefore, its plural forms are no longer
Buch, Buche, Buchen, Buch, but Bücher, Bücher, Büchern und Bücher.
This process also happens in Middle High German neuters, with a root vowel that cannot be umlauted, such as Kind. Finally, the morphological development of Middle High German Wort shows that the Hühnerhof-Deklination was not the only source that contributed to the Numerusprofilierung of the Middle High German strong neuters. As you know, the plural of New High German Wort can be either
Wort or Wörter.
In the case of the umlaut plural, Middle High German Wort has followed the
Bücher, Bücher, Büchern und Bücher,
while the umlautless plural is based on the inflection third-class masculines such as Tag. Incidentally, the development towards number marking and away from case marking did not end with early New High German. The most obvious developments in this direction are the appearance of a new plural marker, the inflectional ending s, as well as the further elimination of inflectional endings such as the dative e. Remember, Aufzug im Brandfalle nicht benutzen. Since the morphological consequences of the apocryphes we discussed in detail in the last lecture affect certain parts of the noun paradigm more than others, but do not differ in principle from the general consequences of the weakening of unstressed syllables, we would not consider these cases separately at this point. Now, verbal inflection. Instead, let us now turn to key developments in Middle High German verbal inflection. First, some remarks on verbal inflection in general. Like their modern successors, Middle High German verb forms realised the grammatical categories of tense, mood, and voice. The grammatical category mood is realised in Middle High German almost exclusively via synthetic means, so without auxiliary verbs, while the grammatical category tense already shows the first signs of using analytical verb forms, which we will go into in the session on syntax. In today's session, only the synthetic methods of Middle High German verb inflection will be discussed. Voice has been expressed by analytical construction since Old High German, and therefore belongs more in a lecture on syntax or morphosyntax, as does the grammatical category person. We've already discussed the category of number in the context of noun inflection. In principle, the system of verb inflection in Middle High German, compared to Old High German, is affected by the same phonological upheavals that take place in the noun system. Therefore, the question must be asked of how specifically morphological restructuring measures, like the weakening of unstressed syllables, and the phonemicization of umlaut, but also rather unspectacular phonetic developments such as final devoicing, have affected Middle High German verbal morphology. As in present-day German, there are several types of verb inflection in Middle High German. The oldest method, going back to Indo-European, is strong inflection, which uses ablaut as a tense marker, a morphologically interpreted alternation of the root vowel, which occurs, for example, in Middle High German,
sniden, sneit,
or, still, in New High German,
schneiden, schnitt.
In Middle High German, there are 7 recurring constellations of such alternations, which are known as ablaut series, and have caused sleepless nights for generations of German students who have had to learn them. The so-called weak verb inflection emerges in Germanic, and uses dental suffix as a tense marker, as in Middle High German,
sagen, sagete,
and in New High German,
sagen, sagte.
In addition, Middle High German has a morphologically hybrid class, the so-called preterite presence, from the core of which a large part of the New High German modal verbs develop, such as Middle High German,
sollen, sollte,
going to New High German,
sollen, sollte,
and a few isolated hybrids such as
denken, dünken,
and
beginnen.
And finally, a number of morphologically irregular verbs, such as Middle High German,
sehen, wellen, turn,
and a few others. First, let's have a look at the strong verbs. From a diachronic point of view, the Middle High German system takes an intermediate position. On the one hand, Middle High German preserves the archaic ablaut system of Old High German with up to 5 different root vowels. We find this constellation in the following ablaut series.
Birgen, Büge, Bauk, Buggen, Geboggen. To be Bierten, Büte, Boot, Butten, Gebotten. 3b. Werfen, Wirfe, Warf, Wurfen, Geworfen. And 4. Nemmen, nimme, nam, namen, genommen.
The fundamental restructuring of the German ablaut system only took place in early New High German, where so-called tense stems with uniform root vowels in the present and past tense developed. On the other hand, the alternation of the root final consonants d, t, h, g, f, b, s, r, known as grammatischer Wechsel, grammatical change, which is still systematically present in Old High German, is already being reduced in strong verb inflection in Middle High German. This is mainly because the old and no longer synchronically transparent alternation rule is superimposed by phonetic innovations in Middle High German, namely the final devoicing change we discussed last week and its complementary development, the lenition of the voiceless dental plosive to voiced d after a nasal. Old High German
Findan, findu, fand, funtun, funtan
exhibits regular grammatischer Wechsel, and accordingly, the root final consonant in the present tense and in the past tense singular is voiced d, and in the past tense plural and in the past participle, voiceless t. Middle High German final devoicing and lenition mean that the alternations in the past tense are reversed, and the grammatischer Wechsel disappears.
Finden, finde, fand, final devoicing, funden, lenischen, gefunden, lenischen.
Ablaut series, which coincidentally formed tense stems in the pre-Middle High German period, so identical root vowels in the present and past tense, tend to reduce the effect of grammatischer Wechsel in Middle High German. Only verbs of the ablaut series 6 and 7 are affected. Old High German
Chladan, chladu, chluot, chluotun, gichlatan.
with a regular alternation of D and T, develops into Middle High German
Laden, ladde, luort, lurden, geladen.
The dismantling of the morphologically redundant grammatischer Wechsel is continuously extended after Middle High German, so that in the contemporary language only a few relic cases such as
schneiden, geschnitten,
or
ziehen, gezogen
occur. A functional innovation in Middle High German verbal inflection that is still operational today is the functionalization of umlaut as a modal marker for strong verbs. For clarification, let us set out a brief reminder of the conditions in present-day German. Strong verbs with a root vowel that cannot be umlauted produce forms of subjunctive 1 by adding the inflectional ending to the present stem,
Rete.
and forms of subjunctive 2 by adding the inflectional ending to the stem of the past tense.
Ritte.
Strong verbs with a root vowel capable of umlaut also mark subjunctive 2 with an umlaut of the root vowel.
Geben, gäbe.
The synthetically formed subjunctive 2 forms of weak verbs do not differ from the forms of the indicative past tense, such that periphrastic forms have to be used here, even with root vowels capable of umlaut, as in the case of New High German.
Wohnen.
The form
Wohnte.
would be considered ungrammatical, and therefore
Würde wohnen.
is required. The last two characteristics of the present-day verbal inflection go back to developments in Middle High German. The functionalization of palatal or secondary umlaut to characterize the preterite subjunctive only takes place in strong verbs with a root vowel capable of umlaut. For example, in geben, a verb of the fifth ablaut series whose root vowel in the subjunctive preterite is the umlaut of a, to air. In the case of strong verbs with root vowels that cannot be umlauted, mood cannot be marked by umlaut, but the root vowels of the affected series, 1 and 7, are so distinctive that the forms remain recognizable as preterites of the subjunctive. Middle High German,
Ritte.
which is the first series, or Middle High German,
Rierte.
the seventh series, can only be first or third person singular preterite subjunctives. The situation is different with weak verbs. Here, umlaut is blocked by the dental suffix, even in the case of root vowels capable of umlaut, so that in the past tense, the forms of the indicative subjunctive cannot be distinguished. In strong verb inflection, umlaut is widely used as a mood marker in Middle High German, as this overview shows. Nevertheless, its functionality can still be optimized. The Middle High German system simply places an umlaut mechanically when in Old High German I follows a vowel that can be umlauted. This is the case throughout the subjunctive preterite, but also in the second person singular preterite indicative, such as Old High German
Du Gabi.
to Middle High German,
Du Gäbe.
Even if this form does not fit into the inflectional scheme of Middle High German at all, it dominated, apart from regional exceptions, particularly in West Central German, in the inflection paradigm over modern forms in Est, and without an umlaut until the 14th century. Only after eliminating this form in early New High German did umlaut fully become a modal marker. Unlike the strong inflection, where the old ablaut system remains largely untouched, weak inflection undergoes a far-reaching restructuring in Middle High German. Before we come to the causes and consequences, a few words about the initial situation. In Old High German, there were three inflection classes of weak verbs: in verbs, on verbs, and jan verbs, recognizable by their respective stem suffixes. Old High German jan verbs can be further subdivided according to two criteria. Firstly, according to the presence or absence of the stem suffix, and secondly, according to the occurrence of an alternation of the root vowel, which is misleadingly called Rückumlaut, or reverse umlaut, and goes back to primary umlaut, the remains of which are still present in New High German. For instance, in
senden, sandte, or nennen, nannte.
As can be seen at first glance, the Middle High German system no longer has much in common with its predecessor. The stem suffixes as a class feature have disappeared. Only the linking vowel and Rückumlaut remain. In turn, two well-known sound changes are responsible for this profound transformation. The weakening of the unstressed syllables levels not only the final syllables, but also the stem suffixes er and or, which were still class-forming in Old High German. There is no synchronic evidence that the Middle High German verbs salben and fühlen once belonged to completely different Old High German inflection classes. In contrast, umlaut becomes increasingly important for the system of Middle High German weak verbs. It had already appeared in a number of Old High German jan verbs, but, being restricted to the primary umlaut of from a, its structural importance remained rather insignificant. With the phonemicization of palatal or secondary umlaut in Middle High German, the prerequisites are met for umlaut to play a central role in weak verb inflection. The Middle High German system makes use of this, at least quantitatively. In his Middle High German grammar, published in 1883, Karl Weinhold identified around 250 lexemes with Rückumlaut. In New High German, this innovative approach of Middle High German has not prevailed, apart from a few cases already mentioned, such as
Nennen, nannte,
and senden Zante, which, by the way, consistently go back to Old High German primary umlaut. At least three factors argue against the consolidation of Ruck umlaut as a tense marker for weak verbs. Some have to do with linguistic universals. Others are more relevant because Ruck umlaut in Middle High German was in the wrong place at the wrong time, so to speak. In its specific distribution, which characterises the infinitive and present tense by the presence of the umlaut and the preterite by the absence of the umlaut, Middle High German Ruck umlaut, like the zero ending in the plural of some nouns, violates the principle of morphological iconism, according to which semantically unmarked units are morphologically more easily encoded than marked ones. In the case of Middle High German, however, the unmarked forms, namely the infinitive and present tense, are morphologically more complex, namely umlauted, while the marked form, the past tense, is morphologically easier to realise, at least insofar as no umlaut is present. The preterite of Middle High German weak verbs with Ruck umlaut is not quite as morphologically simple, as it has a tense marker that has been tried and tested since Germanic, namely the dental suffix, which is more economical than secondary umlaut. The signifier T consistently refers to the same meaning, namely preterite, while Ruck umlaut involves more complex allomorphic relationships. It's mainly for this last reason that the price for a redundant marking of tense was probably too high here. Principles such as morphological iconism and avoidance of redundancy can be found in many languages and at many times. However, there is a further possible reason for abandoning Ruck umlaut as a tense marker, which has to do with the specific situation of verb inflection at the threshold from Middle to early New High German. On the whole, the inherited Old High German inventory of strong verbs remains untouched. However, a simple comparison of the class changes shows that the weak verbs have become the class growing in size since late Middle High German at the latest, with
schrien, spieven, sneeven, geschehen, jehen, pflegen, heffen, entsebben, erren, rufen, wurfen.
At least 11 formerly strong verbs in Middle High German are entirely or partially inflected with weak inflection, while the reverse constellation only occurs 4 times, namely with
nieden, truven, eischen, and verkunnen.
In this situation, a pattern of verb inflection, which wants to introduce an originally strong method into the weak inflection with alternating root vowels, is highly unfavoured. This development will be accentuated towards New High German. The current standard language exhibits an immense and ever-increasing set of weak verbs that were originally strong, while reverse cases are merely anecdotal and probably more lexical than morphological, because, as in the case of the inorganic strong particles,
verwunschen and durchgewunken,
they only affect parts of the inflectional paradigm. Furthermore, only the weak pattern is still productive today. Neologisms or borrowings do not form their pressure with ablaut, but with the dental suffix. In addition to the neologism
simsen,
which means to text, which is admittedly not entirely new, regular strong forms
sams and gesumsen
could not be formed along the lines of
binden, band, gebunden.
The fact that the past tense in usage is not
sams but simste
shows that in modern German, only the weak inflection is productive. Back to Middle High German Ruck umlaut. Beyond the individual case, this example shows that sound changes in language history can often trigger morphological changes, but that no morphophonological automations can be derived from such observations. In the final lecture of this series, which will deal with the syntax of Middle High German, we will certainly come back to the insight that developments on a certain linguistic level can, but do not have to, have an impact on subsequent, more complex linguistic levels. The interfaces between inflectional morphology and the subject of the next lecture on Middle High German word formation and lexis are less obvious, but this is certainly also due to the fact that very heterogeneous issues are treated under the umbrella of morphology, namely grammatical issues like inflectional morphemes on the one hand, and lexical issues like base morphemes on the other.
Thank you.